I grew up with James. From the time we were 7 and still learning how to throw a baseball straight, he'd been my best friend. Summers were always spent at his place. His house was practically a second home to me. His mom would make us peanut butter sandwiches, and we'd spend the afternoons running wild in his backyard, building forts out of old blankets and pretending we were heroes in some grand adventure. James had an older brother, Mark. He was 4 years our senior, which, back then, felt like a lifetime. Mark was the cool one, the one who didn't have to pretend to be grown up because he practically already was. He always seemed distant, not in a harsh way, but in that effortless way older siblings often are. He had his own friends, his own life, and the kind of quiet confidence I always admired but could never quite understand. Sometimes, he'd pass through the living room while James and I played video games, tossing his keys on the counter or grabbing a soda from the fridge. He'd nod in my direction, a silent acknowledgement I always found strangely comforting. I'd nod back, even if my palms grew a little sweaty. Mark was tall, with dark hair and eyes that always seemed to be thinking about something important. He had this way of looking right at you, like he actually saw you. I guess I always respected that about him. The years went by like that, predictable and unchanging. James and I grew closer, inseparable through middle school and then high school. Mark graduated and went off to college, but he came back every summer, sliding back into his familiar role in the house as if he'd never left. He worked odd jobs, mostly construction and maintenance, always with the same quiet calm. He'd nod at me when I came over, sometimes say hello if he wasn't busy. But that summer was different. James had gotten himself a summer job 3 hours, away at some outdoor adventure camp. He'd told me about it for weeks, how he was going to teach kids how to rock climb and hike trails. He was excited, and I was happy for him, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being left behind. James and I had never spent a summer apart before. It was late June when I got the call. I was sprawled out on my bed, the air conditioning humming softly, when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first, but answered anyway. "Hey, it's Mark," the voice said, smooth and confident. I sat up a little straighter. Mark never called me. He barely spoke to me unless I was over at the house. "Hey, Mark?" I replied, half questioning if I'd heard correctly. "Yeah. James mentioned you might be bored this summer. Figured since he's not around, you'd want to come by. I'm just here alone. Thought it'd be better than sitting around doing nothing." I blinked, the invitation catching me off guard. Mark wanted me to come over? Just me? I hesitated, glancing around my empty room. Yeah, sure. I mean, if you don't mind. He chuckled, low and smooth. "I wouldn't have called if I minded. Bring your stuff. Stay the night if you want. It's just me here anyway." We hung up, and I stared at the screen for a long moment. Mark's name still bright against the display. I couldn't explain the flutter in my chest. Whether it was nerves or excitement, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that it was different. Mark had never invited me over before, not like this. I packed a bag, tossing in some clothes, a toothbrush, and a book I'd been meaning to finish. I tried not to overthink it. After all, it was just a sleepover. A simple, friendly invitation. But as I threw my backpack over my shoulder and headed out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that this summer was about to be unlike any I'd known before. Mark's house felt different when it was just the two of us. I'd been there, countless times before, always with James, loud, energetic, filling every room with his laughter. But now, the silence stretched long and thin, settling between the walls and under the soft glow of the living room lamps. I stepped inside, dropping my backpack near the door. Mark was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, brow slightly furrowed. As he chopped vegetables with practiced ease, he glanced up when he heard me, offering a quick smile. "Didn't think you'd actually come," he said, his voice smooth and casual. I forced a grin. "I didn't think you actually wanted me to." Mark chuckled, setting the knife down. "I wouldn't have called if I didn't." He wiped his hands on a dish towel and nodded toward the kitchen island. "Hope you're hungry. I'm making stir-fry." I moved closer, the smell of garlic and fresh vegetables already filling the space. "Need help?" He paused, looking at me thoughtfully. "Yeah, actually. Here." He handed me a cutting board and some peppers. Think you can handle these? I nodded, taking my spot beside him. For a while, we worked in easy silence, the only sounds the rhythm of chopping and the occasional sizzle from the pan. Mark moved with confidence, every motion precise and unhurried. I stole glances when I thought he wasn't looking, at the way his forearms tensed as he stirred the pan, how his jaw clenched slightly when he concentrated. So, you and James still causing trouble? Mark asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I laughed. Not since he left. I'm pretty much on my own for that now. Mark raised an eyebrow. You don't get into trouble on your own? Not the fun kind, I admitted. He laughed. A real, genuine laugh that caught me off guard. I couldn't remember ever hearing it before. It was warm, almost inviting. Maybe we can change that, he said, his eyes glimmering with something I couldn't quite place. We finished cooking, plating the food and settling down at the small table in the corner of the kitchen. The space felt cozier than I remembered. The light softer, the walls closer. Or maybe it was just that I'd never really been alone here before. Not with Mark. Dinner was simple. Rice and stir-fried vegetables. But it felt like more. He asked me things, real things. About school, about what I wanted to do after. Things he never bothered to ask when James was around. He listened too, nodding and asking follow-up questions, like he genuinely cared. It was strange, but not unwelcome. You're different than I remember, he said, pushing his plate away and leaning back in his chair. I blinked, surprised. Different? He shrugged. Yeah, quieter. More thoughtful, I guess. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just laughed awkwardly. Maybe you're just paying more attention now. His gaze lingered, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. Maybe, he said softly, almost like it was a confession. A silence settled between us again, heavier this time. He broke it with a nod toward the living room. You want to watch something? I nodded, grateful for the change of pace. We moved to the couch, sinking into the worn cushions. Mark grabbed the remote and flicked through the options, finally landing on some old action movie. I didn't care what it was. I was more aware of the space between us, the way his arm rested on the back of the couch, fingers just inches from my shoulder. The movie played, explosions and gunfire filling the silence, but I barely registered it. I was too busy noticing the little things. How Mark stretched out, his body relaxed but poised. How his eyes flickered to me every now and then, like he was making sure I was still there. Halfway through, he reached for the remote to turn down the volume. You comfortable? He asked, his voice quieter now. I nodded. Yeah. He smiled, a small, almost secretive grin that I couldn't quite read. Good. We fell back into silence, the kind that was strangely comfortable and heavy with something I couldn't name. My heart thrummed in my chest, steady and loud, and I wondered if he could hear it. I stole a glance his way, only to find him already watching me. I looked away first. He didn't. The movie's credits rolled across the screen, white letters, floating up against the black backdrop, but neither of us moved. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I hadn't realized how close we'd gotten. My shoulder nearly brushing his, our knees almost touching on the worn-out cushions of the couch. I shifted slightly, and that's when I felt his eyes on me. I glanced up, half expecting him to look away, but he didn't. Mark's gaze was steady, contemplative, as if he were seeing me for the first time. I swallowed hard, my heart picking up its pace, and for a moment the silence grew too loud. You've changed, you know, he said, quietly, breaking the stillness. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. I blinked, thrown off by the sudden statement. Me? He nodded, his eyes not leaving mine. Yeah, you're different now. I laughed nervously, scratching the back of my neck. That good or bad? Mark's lips curled into a small smile. Good. Definitely good. My throat felt dry. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just stared back at him, my mind racing with 1,000 questions I couldn't ask. Mark leaned back slightly, stretching his arms out along the back of the couch. His fingers brushed against my shoulder, just barely, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I didn't move. I couldn't. His hand lingered there, his fingertips warm against the fabric of my shirt. You know, I don't really talk to James that much anymore, he said suddenly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Not like we used to. That surprised me. James and Mark had always seemed fine. Brothers with the usual annoyances, but nothing out of the ordinary. Why not? I asked, leaning in a bit, my curiosity getting the better of me. He shrugged, his gaze flickering away for a moment before settling back on me. I don't know. Life, I guess. He got busy with his own stuff. I got busy with mine. We just drifted. He paused, his eyes searching mine. I guess I just miss having someone around to talk to. There was something raw in his voice, an honesty I hadn't expected. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that mattered, but the words tangled in my throat. I'm here now, I said finally, the words feeling heavier than I intended. Mark's eyes softened, his hand still on my shoulder, a gentle weight that felt almost protective. Yeah, he murmured. You are. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It settled around us like a blanket, warm and unspoken. Mark's hand squeezed my shoulder. Just a little, just enough for me to notice. His touch lingered, fingers brushing over the fabric as if testing the waters. I should have moved. I should have shrugged it off, made a joke, done anything to break the tension, but I didn't. My heart thudded in my chest, and I stayed exactly where I was. Mark's eyes flickered back to mine, searching for something. Permission, maybe. Understanding. I wasn't sure, but I didn't look away. We stayed like that, locked in place, the air between us growing heavier by the second. Finally, Mark cleared his throat, pulling his hand back slowly, fingers trailing just slightly as if reluctant to let go. We should, probably get some sleep, he said, his voice a little rough around the edges. I nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, probably. He stood up, stretching his arms above his head, his shirt lifting just enough to reveal a sliver of skin. I looked away quickly, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. Mark walked toward the stairs, pausing at the first step to glance back at me. You coming? He asked, his voice softer now. I nodded again, standing up and grabbing my bag from beside the couch. We climbed the stairs in silence, footsteps echoing off the walls. At the top, Mark stopped in front of his room, his hand resting on the doorframe. I was about to keep walking when he turned back to me, his eyes catching mine in the dim hallway light. Good night, he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. But there was something in the way he said it. Soft, lingering, almost like a promise. I swallowed, forcing the word out. Good night. We stood there for a second longer, neither of us moving. Then Mark smiled, just a small curve of his lips, almost too quick to catch, and slipped into his room, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the silence that followed, my heart still pounding in my chest. I finally made my way to the guest room, shutting the door quietly behind me, but sleep didn't come easily. Not that night. The room was dark, the kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones. I lay on the guest bed, staring up at the ceiling, tracing the faint patterns of light that slipped through the blinds. Sleep wouldn't come, not with the way my mind replayed the night over and over again, dissecting every look, every word, every lingering touch. I kept thinking about the way Mark's hand had rested on my shoulder, the weight of it, the warmth that seeped through my shirt. I could still feel it, like his touch had somehow branded me. I turned over for what felt like the 100th time, pressing my face into the pillow and exhaling slowly. But it didn't help. I was wide awake, heart still hammering. That's when I heard it, a soft knock at the door, barely more than a whisper against the stillness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Another knock followed, gentle but persistent. I sat up, the sheets rustling around me. Yeah? I called out, voice low. The door creaked open and there he was. Mark stood in the hallway, One hand braced on the doorframe, the other shoved deep into the pocket of his sweatpants. His hair was mussed, eyes shadowed and tired. He looked at me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Hey," he finally said, his voice hushed. "Did I wake you?" I shook my head. "No, I couldn't sleep." He nodded, lingering there for a second longer before stepping inside, the door clicking shut behind him. He didn't turn on the light. Instead, he moved toward the bed, his steps careful, deliberate. He paused just beside the edge, glancing down at me. "Mind if I sit?" "Yeah, sure." I shuffled over, making room. He sat down, the mattress dipping under his weight. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that felt too heavy, too loud. Moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting pale shadows across the walls. Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced together. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. I wanted to say something. Ask him if he was okay, if something had happened. But the words tangled in my throat. Finally he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't think I'd actually come in here." I blinked, surprised. "Why did you?" He paused, his hands twisting together, "Because I couldn't sleep either. And I figured maybe talking would help." "About what?" He let out a breath, one that sounded like he'd been holding it for too long. "About you. About this." He gestured vaguely between us, his hand dropping back to his lap. I stared at him, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Mark, what do you mean?" His eyes found mine then, steady and unflinching. "I've always noticed you," he said, his voice soft but certain. "Even back when you and James were just kids running around the backyard. You always seemed different." I swallowed hard. Different how? A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. But it was sadder than I expected. Kinder, quieter. You actually listened when people talked. Not a lot of people do that. He hesitated, eyes dropping to his hands. "I never acted on it. Because of James. He's your best friend. And you're you." I felt my cheeks flush. "I'm me?" "Yeah." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're you." He looked back up, and there was something raw in his expression. Something unguarded that I'd never seen before. And I couldn't stop thinking about you, no matter how much I tried. I stared at him, the room suddenly feeling much smaller than it had before. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker. My hands rested in my lap, fingers curled together to stop them from shaking. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I could say anything at all. Mark must have seen the conflict written all over my face, because his hand moved, slowly, carefully, until it rested over mine. His touch was warm, familiar, but electric in a way that sent a shiver up my spine. He didn't pull away. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost fragile. I looked down at our hands, his larger, rougher from years of work, mine smaller but steady beneath his. I swallowed, nodding before I could second-guess it. "Yeah, it's okay." He exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just a little. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, a slow, gentle motion that felt like a promise. We sat like that for a long time, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking. Finally, Mark broke the silence, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "I'm tired of pretending." My chest tightened, but I didn't pull away. "Me too." His hand lingered on mine for a moment longer before he squeezed it gently, his eyes meeting mine with a softness that made my heart ache. "Good," he whispered. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. Sunlight spilled through the blinds, casting long streaks of gold across the floor. I blinked awake, disoriented for a moment before the events of the night came flooding back. Mark, his hand on mine. The whispered confessions that hung between us like fragile glass. I sat up slowly, my heart still fluttering in my chest. The room was quiet, still wrapped in that early morning hush. I slipped out of bed, padding softly to the door. The hallway was empty, sunlight pooling in patches along the walls. From downstairs, I caught the faint crackle of something frying. Followed the sound to the kitchen, and there he was. Mark stood at the stove, spatula in hand, flipping pancakes with an ease that seemed almost practiced. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard me, a small smile spreading across his face. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "Morning." I leaned against the doorway, watching him work. It felt surreal, seeing him like this, softened by the early light, eyes clear and untroubled, like last night hadn't been some fever dream. "You hungry?" he asked, turning back to the stove. "Yeah. Starving, actually." Mark chuckled. "Good. Hope you like pancakes." He plated a stack, sliding them onto the counter before pouring 2 cups of coffee. I joined him, pulling up a stool and settling into the familiar creak of the wooden seat. We ate in silence for a while, the clink of forks on plates the only sound between us. I stole glances when I thought he wasn't looking, catching the way his eyes softened when they landed on me, the slight curve of his lips as he ate. Everything felt heavier, more significant. The sunlight seemed brighter, the room warmer. I couldn't stop the flush that crept up my neck every time our eyes met. Halfway through breakfast, Mark's phone buzzed on the counter. He wiped his hands on a towel before picking it up, his expression softening for a moment before hardening just as quickly. "It's James," he said, glancing at me. "Oh." I set my fork down, suddenly feeling the weight of his name. "Mark," answered, his voice slipping into that familiar casualness. "Hey man, what's up?" I couldn't hear James's side, but whatever he said made Mark's shoulders tense. He shot me a quick glance, his eyes darkening just slightly. "Yeah? That's earlier than you planned." He paused, nodding absently. "No, it's fine." "Yeah, I'll see you then." He hung up, setting the phone back down with a quiet click. His expression was tight, like he was trying to keep something back. "He's coming back early?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. Some mix-up at the camp. He'll be back tomorrow." The words hung heavy between us, thickening the air. I glanced down at my plate, appetite suddenly gone. "Oh." Mark's jaw clenched, his eyes flickering to mine. "We should talk, before he gets back." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in my chest. "Yeah. We probably should." Without another word, he pushed back from the counter, nodding toward the back door. "Come on." I followed him outside, the morning sun bright and warm against my skin. The porch creaked beneath our weight as we sat down on the worn wooden steps, sunlight spilling over the grass like a blanket. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the trees. I waited, the silence stretching long between us. Finally he spoke, his voice soft and steady. "I don't want this to just be some one-time thing," he admitted, eyes still locked on the horizon. "I don't think I could handle that." I stared at him, the confession washing over me, like a wave. My heart pounded, every beat echoing the truth I hadn't been brave enough to say out loud. "I don't want that either," I replied, the words coming easier than I expected. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine, raw and unguarded. "But James, I don't know how he'd take it." I nodded, the reality of it settling like a weight in my stomach. "Me neither." We sat in silence for a long while, the sun climbing higher in the sky, spilling warmth over our shoulders. There were no answers, no solutions that made sense yet. But the understanding was there, the unspoken promise that this wasn't just a fleeting moment. Mark turned to me, his eyes softening. "We'll figure it out." I believed him. The sunlight that poured through the window seemed brighter that morning, almost intrusive. I packed my things quietly, folding shirts and stuffing them into my backpack with more care than necessary. Each item I placed inside felt like I was locking away a piece of the weekend, sealing it up tight before it could slip away. I zipped up the bag and sat down on the edge of the bed, the silence pressing against my ears. Mark's footsteps sounded soft in the hallway before he appeared at the doorframe, leaning against it casually, arms crossed over his chest. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice soft, almost resigned. I nodded, clearing my throat. "Yeah, James said he'd be back around noon. Figured I should probably head out before he shows up." Mark stepped inside, glancing around the room like he was looking for something to say. His eyes settled on my backpack, and he nodded slowly. "Need help?" "Sure." He walked over, picking up the heavier duffel bag I'd packed, slinging it over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. I followed him down the stairs, the air thick with the kind of silence that spoke more than words ever could. We reached the front door, and Mark set the bag down gently. He stood there, his hand resting on the handle, his eyes fixed on me with a look I couldn't quite read. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I shifted my weight, my hand still clutching the strap of my backpack. "Well," I started, forcing a smile. "Thanks for, everything." He didn't smile back. His eyes softened, gaze lingering on me with that same intensity I'd felt all weekend. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, voice low and sincere. My heart pounded painfully. In my chest, the reality of leaving pressing down harder with every second that passed. I hesitated, hands still on the strap, feet still planted firmly on the hardwood floor. I couldn't move. Not yet. Mark stepped forward, closing the space between us. His hand reached out, brushing my shoulder lightly before his fingers wrapped around it, squeezing just enough for me to feel the warmth of his grip. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes held mine, unyielding and unspoken. Before I could say anything, he pulled me into a hug. Soft, deliberate, his arms wrapped around me with a tenderness that stole the air from my lungs. I hugged him back, feeling the warmth of him, the strength of his hold. His hand rested against my back, fingertips pressing gently as if committing the moment to memory. "This isn't the end," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. The words were soft, almost a plea, almost a promise. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding on to him just a little longer. My hands clutched the back of his shirt, fingers curling into the fabric. "I know," I whispered back, my voice barely a breath. Pulled back slowly, his hands lingering on my arms before finally letting go. I stepped back, the distance feeling like miles instead of inches. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, fingers tightening around the strap, as I forced myself to look at him one last time. Mark's eyes didn't leave mine. There was something raw in his expression, something that made my chest ache. I opened my mouth to say something, to tell him I'd be back, that we'd figure it out. But the words tangled up in my throat. So I just nodded, a small gesture that somehow felt like everything I couldn't say. Mark nodded back, his jaw clenched, hands stuffed into his pockets as if holding himself in place. I turned toward the door, my hand wrapping around the cool metal of the handle. I pulled it open, the morning air rushing in, sharp and fresh. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. I didn't look back, not until I reached the car. When I finally turned, he was still there, framed in the doorway, watching me. His hand lifted in a wave, slow and deliberate. I waved back, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I took one last look. Mark was still standing there, his silhouette framed by the morning light, his eyes still locked on mine. I drove away, the road stretching out before me, empty and open. My heart pounded, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I didn't know what would happen next, didn't know what any of this meant. But for the first time in a long while, I was hopeful. Weeks slipped by quietly, unassuming. James came back with stories of adventure, tales of climbing mountains and building bonfires, his enthusiasm contagious. I listened, nodded, laughed at the right moments, but my mind wandered more often than not. Mark and I didn't talk about that weekend. Not in the way I thought we might. There were no grand conversations or drawn-out explanations. Instead, it was small things. Glances held just a little too long. The way his hand brushed mine when I walked past. The knowing looks, We exchanged when James wasn't paying attention. It felt like a secret, tucked safely between us. Something fragile but real. Mark would text me sometimes, simple things. You coming by? Or James is out. Want to watch a movie? I'd always say yes. We met up more than I could count. Always at his place, always quiet. Sometimes we'd talk, about nothing and everything. Other times, we'd sit in comfortable silence, shoulders nearly touching on the couch, our breaths syncing up without even trying. I caught myself staring more often. At the way his jaw clenched when he concentrated, the way his hands moved when he spoke. He'd catch me sometimes, and he'd smile, soft and unguarded, like he knew something I didn't. One evening I found myself on his porch again, the sun setting low behind the trees. We sat side by side, the silence stretching long and easy. I turned to him, watching as the light caught the edges of his hair, casting him in a warm glow. He looked over, his eyes meeting mine with that familiar intensity. I still can't believe this is happening, I admitted, my voice barely above. A whisper. He smiled, leaning back in his chair. Me neither. He paused, glancing down at his hands. But I'm glad it is. I nodded, the weight of those words settling comfortably between us. Me too. We stayed like that for a while, the air growing cooler as the sun slipped lower. He reached out, his hand finding mine, fingers curling gently. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I knew what he meant. I thought back to that night. The simple invitation. The way everything had changed without warning. It all felt so unexpected, like stumbling upon something you didn't even know you were looking for. Mark squeezed my hand, pulling me back to the present. His eyes were on me, warm and steady. I smiled, my heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Sometimes the best things are the ones you never see coming.